Hello and welcome to our new webinar series, Stories from the Archives. Every few months we will explore the stories behind the treasures and unique family history artifacts found in the R. Stanton Avery Special Collections and the archives at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at American Ancestors. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming. I will be your moderator for today's program. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we do lose connection for any reason, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording on our website. Our presenter today is Senior Archivist Judy Lucey. Judy joined the staff in 2003 and works to collect, catalog, and care for the millions of individual items in the R. Stanton Avery Special Collections. She received a BS in Education from Northeastern University and an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons College. Her areas of genealogical expertise include Irish genealogy, Newfoundland, 19th and 20th century genealogy, beginning genealogy, and Italian family history. So today we're going to examine several objects of mourning, including letters of condolence, coffin plates, jewelry, memorials, and more from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Each object has its unique place in history and family memory. We'll hear the stories behind these items and the families who donated them, and gain some tips on caring for items in our own collections. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is no handout for this session, but as I just noted, we are recording this session. You will be able to watch a recording of this event starting tomorrow on our website. So if you missed something on today's first listen, you need to step away, or you just kind of want to come back to this at any point, you can, and you'll just find that for free on our website. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Judy.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome again, everyone. I am delighted to be with you today as we kick off the first in a series of webinars highlighting stories from the archives. No matter what our backgrounds are, whether we're rich, poor, young, old, whatever our differences may be, what we all have in common is the loss or death of a loved one. And for those of us left behind, for the living, it can leave a void in our lives. Our ancestors experienced the same. And throughout history, people have had ways to honor, commemorate their loved ones, and to express their grief through art, jewelry, fashion, writings, memorials, etc. And we're going to explore some of the ways in today's presentation. As an archivist, I am caretaker of these many treasures, and I am honored to do so. And frequently I have objects such as you'll see here in today's presentation that I'm not truly an expert on, but I've tried to gain some knowledge. So just a little bit of a heads up on that. Art, jewelry, clothing, photography for centuries has offered the bereaved a way to explore one's relationship with death and to process the grief in a more open and public manner. In this segment of our presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of these items from the NEHGS Special Collections. When we think of the topic Art of Mourning and what we know of the subject, most likely comes from the 19th century, when public displays of grief reached its pinnacle. The two big influences in this time period were Queen Victoria and our own Civil War. No one wore grief better than Queen Victoria. After the loss of her husband Albert in 1861, She wore a locket of Albert's hair around her neck, and she dressed in mourning clothing and jewelry for the remainder of her life. Victoria's public grief had an enormous influence on mourning fashion in the mid to late 19th century. Here in America, the loss of so many in the Civil War gave way to a movement of mourning fashion and trying to capture the memory of a loved one lost through photography, jewelry, and also fashion. There are different kinds of mourning photographs or photography. There is the post-mortem photography, where photos of deceased loved ones were taken. This was especially true with photos of deceased children. The high mortality rate of infants and young children in the 19th century from disease or from an epidemic such as typhus, diphtheria, dysentery, along with the onset of photography in the 19th century, was a way for parents to commemorate their loved ones and soothe their grief. It was also a common practice to use post-mortem photography in mourning jewelry as well. And some of you may actually have post-mortem photography among your own family treasures. 2 years ago, we had an in-house exhibit here at NEHGS titled Memorials in Mourning, Material Expressions of Grief, and I was tasked with identifying items from our special collections that would fit the themes of the exhibit. And I was absolutely sure that we had photos in our collection with either post-mortem photos or at the very least photographs of people in mourning clothing, but I couldn't find any. So we had to purchase several of these for our exhibit. And this is what you see here. You see some of the photos that we purchased. On the far left is a young boy, we believe from maybe World War I era, or at least close to 1920. And here you can identify that he's in mourning with a black armband and a prayer book in his hand. All we know of the photograph postcard on the far right is the date, which was written on the back, July 28, 1918, and that it was taken somewhere in Eastern Europe. But we know that it's a mourning photograph because of what? Because of the black veil that the woman is wearing. Now, if you quickly glance at the photo in the center, you may not notice at first that it is a mourning photograph, but if you look carefully, you will see that the woman seated is holding a photograph of a loved one, most likely a deceased loved one. So, do you have any of these types of photographs among your family photo albums? Memorializing loved ones lost through jewelry was expressed in rings, brooches, bracelets, necklaces, and other types of jewelry. And perhaps you may have some of these pieces. So what are the identifying features to look for in mourning jewelry? Well, first of all, there's hair. Was a big part of mourning jewelry. An inscription, usually with the date of death, or some expression like in memory of. You also want to look at the color. Frequently, mourning jewelry is in sepia or ivory tones. Black jewelry was frequently used, what's called jet jewelry. Jet was a form of fossilized driftwood like coal and was frequently used in mourning jewelry, but also pearls were frequently used as well, and they frequently represented a child lost. You'll also find symbols like urns with an inscription, weeping willows, angels, birds, etc. The piece you see here is one of several pieces of mourning jewelry from the Thaxter Park Spencer collection. Thaxter, or Ted as he was commonly referred to, was the family caretaker of all the family artwork, mourning jewelry, samplers, family papers, photographs. He was very interested in his family history, but he preferred the flesh on the bone, the stories, rather than the genealogical data. And among the possessions in his care were a few pieces of jewelry that were donated to us about 15 years ago. So what are some of the identifiers in this particular piece of jewelry? Well, we've got the black color, the black beaded glass. We have the hair piece in the middle. More importantly, we have the provenance, the inscription on the back, which says Mrs. Lucey Jackson, died 1830 at the age of 64. And according to the official city records for the city of Boston, she was recorded as dying at age 61 when she died of dysentery on the 29th of September 1830. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But I suspect perhaps the family may have known her age at the time of death, more so than whoever reported the death to the city. We do know that Lucey was born, Lucey Nash was her maiden name. Born in Scituate, she married Ward Jackson in 1792. We don't know much about Lucey's life, except that her family mourned her death and had this piece made to commemorate their beloved mother and wife. And it was probably worn by one of her two daughters. This is one of our oldest pieces of mourning art in our collection. It's the Gookin Hatchment. So what exactly is a hatchment? Well, it's a heraldic memorial to a deceased person. And hatchments emerged in the 17th century from the earlier medieval practice of erecting the shield and other military accoutrements over the tombs of military knights. This hatchment we believe to have been created after the death of Thomas Gookin. The diamond painted panel probably hung on the exterior of Thomas's house in Ripple Court near Deal in Kent, England, which, by the way, still stands, during a period of mourning, which could last anywhere from 40 days to 12 months, and then was transferred to Thomas's parish church, where it would hang somewhere in the interior. The hatchment here that you see depicts Thomas's family coat of arms, and on the left, with the chevron and roosters, is his own family's coat of arms, quartered by those of the Durants, his grandmother's family. At the right of the hatchment is impaled with the arms of his wife, Jane Edolph Gookin. Now, to the reader of heraldic symbols, the black background here indicates that Jane died before her husband, which indeed she did. She died 5 days earlier. Had she still been living at the time of her husband's death, the right side of the hatchment would have been painted white, or it would have been left unpainted. And then presiding over the whole thing is a large rooster at the top. The donor of this hatchment was John Wingate Thornton of Maine, and he is well known here at NEHGS as he was one of the 5 founders of the society. John was a historian and a lawyer who published many family volumes on genealogical topics, including the history of the Gookin family. And the reason for his great interest in Gookin was that his maternal line, his mother was a Gookin. And he donated this to us in 1871, and I can't help but think that it coincided with his trip to England in the same year, where he went to research and look at the places where his ancestors came from. This image of Elizabeth Royall lying on her deathbed, dressed in a white bonnet and nightgown and enclosed with the blue bed hangings you see here, is generally believed to be the earliest New England posthumous portrait and possibly the first in the American colonies. And it is attributed to Joseph Badger of Boston. Elizabeth died at the age of 7. She was the daughter of Isaac Royall Jr., who was born in 1719 and died in 1781, of Medford, Massachusetts. Her grandfather was Isaac Royall Sr., who was known as a wealthy colonial merchant and slave trader, and who established the family's estate on the Mystic River sometime in the 1730s. We know a little bit about the artist Joseph Badger. We know that he worked as a house painter and a glazier in the city of Boston. He was he also supplemented his income by doing portrait paintings. Although he is criticized by modern art historians as being rather amateurish and limited, he was nevertheless, his work appealed to many New Englanders, given the fact that there are some 150 unsigned portraits painted between 1743 and about the time of his death in 1765 that have been attributed to him. In spite of his popularity, Badger struggled to make a living, and he and his wife had to sell their house to settle their debts. The photo on the right is the royal home, which still stands in Medford, Massachusetts, and is open to the public for tours. And you can see the slave quarters there on the right to the right of the home. On the left here is the portrait of Elizabeth's younger sister, Mary. And for many years, attached to the back of the stretchers used for this portrait was, I'm sorry, let me start over. It was Elizabeth's portrait was attached to the back with stretchers to the back of Mary's portrait. Mary is shown here, we believe, to be about 14 or 15, and again, Joseph Badger is attributed with painting her portrait. Mary married in 1775 to another successful merchant family of the city of Boston, George Irving. And like the Royals, the Irvings were loyalists, and they fled to London at the time of the Revolution. They settled in Upper Royal in Hampshire, occupying a country estate called the Shrubbery. And Mary's father died there in 1781 during a smallpox epidemic. Mary would die a few years later at the age of 42, and she's buried in the same tomb with her father. It was very popular in the decorative arts and in art to commemorate important historical figures. And this rare commemorative engraving honors John Hancock, and it features a bust-length portrait of John Hancock in the middle, and we believe it was produced sometime after his death in 1795. Hancock appears in a blue coat framed by the laurel leaves, which is a symbol of victory, and the phrase above the portrait says, "The man whom the people delighted to honor," and that appears in the banner above the portrait. Interestingly, this oval portrait, we believe, was engraved on a separate piece of paper and applied to this after the rest of the material was done. The Society has a number of pieces associated with the Hancock family in its fine art collection, including a Queen Anne chair from the mansion and a very rare broadside printed in 1863 as part of the campaign to prevent the demolition of the John Hancock mansion. When Hancock died in 1793, he left no direct heirs. Tragically, John Hancock and his wife Dorothy, both of their children would predecease them, with their daughter Lydia dying as an infant in 1777. And their only son, John George Washington Hancock, died in 1787 at the age of 9. Now, his death is attributed to his having hit his head while ice skating in Milton, Massachusetts. I've also seen where the story is that he hit his head after trying on skates on an icy Boston sidewalk and hit his head, but we believe it was while skating in Milton, Massachusetts. Samuel Dorr is the person that drew this. He was a young man, a student at the South School on Pleasant Street in Boston. And this elegy was given as a penmanship exercise. It is really a beautiful piece of American folk art and was donated to us in 1859. This lithograph print was published by Nathaniel Currier of the Currier and Ives Partnership. and it was used to record the death of Ruth Lincoln on the 19th of July, 1829 at the age of 74, and the death of her husband Abner, who died on the 22nd of June, 1840, in the 87th year of his age. Given that this is a Nathaniel Currier print and not of his time with Currier and his partner James Ives, we believe the date to be sometime in the 1840s when Currier was publishing these items. James Ives, his partner, would join in this together with Nathaniel in 1852. So you'll see here the common symbols of grief used in mourning art: the weeping willow, the urn, and of course the grief-stricken women dressed in black. The church and the graveyard are illustrated in the background. Again, we don't know too much about the Lincolns. We know that Ruth's maiden name is Perry, that they resided in Taunton, Massachusetts, and that Abner served in the Revolutionary War. If you look Abner up on, say, a place like Ancestry.com, his death date usually appears as July 22nd, but town records and this lithograph record his date as June 22nd. And there's also a small poem that's written at the bottom. My children dear, pray draw near, a father's grave you see. Not long ago I was with you, and soon you'll be with me. Here's a family register, a lithograph print, again, published by Nathaniel Currier about 1846. And the register was used to record the names and dates, birth, marriage, and death of the Joseph and Anne Frost Howland family of New Bedford, Massachusetts. And you see here in the lithograph, it shows all the scenes of life: birth, marriage, and death. And I particularly have blown up the death scene here because it's a little bit unusual. Usually in Currier's prints, the death scene is the type of symbols we're accustomed to seeing: the weeping willow, the urn, the woman draped in black. But here it's the scene of parents and siblings around the deathbed of a child, along with the family dog. This item was used to record the vital records for this family in the published volume of the New Bedford, Massachusetts Vital Records pre-1850. And it was given to us by Goodspeed's bookshop here in Boston in 1921. Lizzie Atkinson was a longtime member of NEHGS. When she wrote her will in 1928, her younger brother John, was her only heir at the time. And in her will, she stated that should he predecease her, she wanted not just her family papers and the genealogical research she had done throughout her life, but the contents of her entire home to come to NEHGS. And when she died in 1933, her brother John had predeceased her by 2 years. So during the Depression, we received not only Lizzie's home, but everything in it. And the furniture and the artwork makes up the core of our decorative arts collection. So 87 years later, this is a gift that keeps on giving to us. And among these pieces are several pieces of mourning art and jewelry. This is really a lovely example of early 19th century American mourning art. It's executed in a style that earlier generations referred to as primitive and what we today would call folk art. The scene focuses on the weeping willow and an urn, those traditional symbols of grief, and flanking the urn are Mary's mourners, an angel and a woman, both wearing mourning shawls. Mary Lancaster died on July 17, 1813, at the age of 9, and she was the daughter of Thomas Lancaster and his wife, Mary Perkins of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Also in the collection is this twin piece, again representing a member of the Lancaster family, and this memorial is dedicated to Henry Lancaster. Henry died at the age of 47 on the 22nd of April, 1816. His parents were John Lancaster and Mary Dodge, and his wife was also a Dodge, Anna, and they resided in Newbury, Massachusetts. One of the things that we inherited or were bequeathed to from the Atkinson Lancaster collection was a box of jewelry, and in it were several mourning pieces. The pin that you see here engraved with braided hair encased in glass memorializes Daniel Moody Lancaster, Lizzie Atkinson's maternal grandfather. He died at the age of 53 in 1855. And he married in July of 1824 at Salem to Lydia Gray Cook, who comes from a long line of Salem sea captains. We don't know much about the piece on the right. What we do know are two things. One, it's a hair bracelet, probably from the hair of a child that passed away at the age of 19 months. He died in September, we believe about 1850. And his name is engraved here. But we don't know is his connection to the family. So we do have some pieces in the Atkinson Lancaster collection where we don't really have any provenance. So now if we took a look at these two examples, are these mourning pieces? And I have to tell you, I'm not really sure, especially the piece on the left. You know, a close cousin to mourning jewelry is sentimental jewelry, so sometimes the forms were used interchangeably. And sentimental jewelry usually defines the love of a person who wore or gave these pieces to them, and they usually displayed them in public. We know that this image, the brooch on the left, was Mary Ann Weston, is engraved on the back, but we don't know who she is and how she relates to the Atkinson Lancaster family. The cameo on the right is very interesting to me. It's always intrigued me. Of course, there's hair on the back that's encased in the back, but the dog, which represents fidelity in images like this, and the two birds kissing, and the angel with the arrow reminds me of Cupid. So I really don't know if this is a mourning piece, but it could be something that was given to a family member as a piece of sentimental jewelry. So if you have items like this in your collection and you're uncertain of either the date, is it a mourning piece? What is the date or provenance of it? Then you really need to consult an expert. And as I mentioned in the opening, as an archivist, I care for items in our collection, but I'm not necessarily an expert. So like you, sometimes I have to do a little bit of research as well and consult experts to learn more about the objects I have in my collection. The NEHGS Special Collections and the Weiner Center for Jewish Heritage has several manuscript items, artwork, photos, and ephemera that commemorate the life or death of an individual or a loved one, or commemorates a historic event or a tragic loss. In the spring of 1918, when the first wave of the influenza epidemic hit the United States, it broke out in the East Coast and parts of the Midwest, but it seemed to bypass the city of Chicago, Illinois. But that would all change by the fall of 1918. On September 8, 1918, a few sailors at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center fell ill with the disease. And then a week later, there were 7 Army cadets from the Northwestern University that came down with influenza. By the middle of September, the epidemic had begun. That by the middle of October, there were up to 1,200 new flu cases and 500 deaths each day. So that by the end of October 1918, Chicago had over 8,000 deaths in the city. If you research the death certificates that are on FamilySearch.org, you will find that for the month of October alone, for 1918, the deaths are on 7 microfilm reels. Among them was Lillian Burkitt, Wiley Schmitt, whom you see here. She was a 37-year-old woman, married with one son, when she died on the 15th of October of pneumonia and acute edema of the lungs. The page you see here is from her mother's scrapbook. The Jane Hutchinson Burkitt Wiley Family Collection was donated to us in 2009 by family members. And while the collection consists of family charts, papers, and ephemera, it's the family scrapbook kept by Jane Wiley that really is the centerpiece of the collection, as it reflects Jane's interest in family history, and it provides genealogical information about the ancestry and descendants of the Wiley and Burkitt families. But it also contains this very sad memorial to her daughter, and Jane used the scrapbook to honor her daughter, but also to highlight certain anniversaries like her birthday and her date of death. So, for example, at the top of this page on the left, she writes, on September 14th, 1921, 3 years ago this morning, we kissed our Lillian goodbye. And on August 26, 1924, she recognizes her date of birth. And on the 15th of October of that same year, she records, she left us 6 years ago today, our darling. You know, this was a very personal, painful experience for Jane, and was part of the family's keepsakes. And now, being here at NEHGS Archives, it becomes a document of historical record. And I think it's very timely, considering the time that we live in. 100 years later, we are now facing a new pandemic. And are people writing down their stories? Will these be donated to an archive in the future? And what about those who have lost loved ones? A photograph, a few letters of condolences, and a printed booklet tied together with black ribbon were donated to us in 1995. And it memorializes the life and death of Norman Peck. Norman was born about 1811 in Hampton, Washington County, New York. He was the son of Seth Peck and Anna Northrup. They were both from Connecticut, who shortly after their marriage, Seth took his bride to Hampton, which was, according to Norman's biography, was wilderness at the time. Years later, Norman would take his own bride, Rosella, to Batavia, New York, where they lived and raised a family before returning to Hampton and then eventually settling in Fairhaven, Vermont, where on the morning of Tuesday, July 15, 1884, Norman took his usual morning constitutional through the town, and after his morning prayers with his family, he stopped to chat with some people, and he was startled by a sound of a falling ladder, and he turned to see where it was coming from, and he lost his balance, fell, and broke his right shoulder. He was taken to his home, cared for by the family doctor and his family, where he survived for 29 days. And on the morning of the 13th of August, with his wife sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, Norman quietly slipped away. Now, this was a very treasured keepsake of the family. This was given to us by a direct descendant of Norman who lived in Texas. But it's also a wonderful genealogical record because it gives us so many of those details that we would love to know about our ancestors. And now it is also a part of NEHGS Archives and is available for genealogical research. This letter was written by President Calvin Coolidge on White House stationery to Abraham Reshevsky. And the letter and the envelope have black borders in observance of the unexpected death of President Harding that occurred just 9 days prior. This is from the Abraham Reshevsky papers from our Jewish Heritage Center. And the letter and the envelope are examples of mourning stationery that typically have the black edging, commonly used around in 19th and 20th century. And although its origins can be traced back to, I think, as far back as the 17th century, mourning stationery really became popular during the Victorian era. You can also indicate the stage of mourning period by the thickness of the border. So, for example, In the earlier stages of mourning, the border would be thicker, and the black edging would lessen as the mourning period passed. Abraham Reshevsky resided here in Boston and was one of the founders of the U.S. Trust Company. On September 10, 1941, a group of German Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators entered the village of Meretz, Lithuania. They gathered together and arrested all of the members of the Jewish community. They herded them into the local synagogue and school, and then they took them out to a grove near the Jewish cemetery, where they were forced to dig their own graves and then shot by Lithuanian partisans. On that day, September 10th, 854 men, women, and children were killed. The photo you see here on the left was erected by the Meretz Relief Association of Boston in 1962 to honor the memory of those killed on that September day. It stands in the Meretz Association Cemetery here in Woburn, Massachusetts, and the photo on the right is an image taken by Elihu Stone, who returned to Meretz in 1931, and he took many photos of the village and some of the families. And the photographs really show a very vibrant Jewish community. And here's an example of one of the Reisner family. We know that there were 2 Reisner families that were killed that day in 1941. We believe this family to be one of them. If you want to learn more about the Meretz Family Association, these records are digitized and online and are available through our digital library and archive. You know, a favorite pastime of genealogists is to traipse through graveyards and to learn more about where and when our ancestors died. And because of that, we have many items related to gravestones, epitaphs, and burials in our collection. These grave photos that you see here are actually broken fragments, and if you look carefully, you'll see those that we pieced together for the purpose of these photographs. They are from the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts record collection, again, part of our Jewish Heritage Center's collection. They are unusual in Judaism, but they're often found in Eastern European Jewish cemeteries. The images of the deceased were burnt into porcelain and glazed, and then placed on the headstone. These particular photographs were created in Bavaria and the other in the former Czechoslovakia. And one is marked in pencil with the name Geller, which indicates to us the family name. But other than that, very little is known about the family origins of these photographs. But we do know that the deceased loved ones, when their families left for America, chose to take them with them and not leave them behind, so that they would always have a keepsake of their families. Coffin plates are a decorative metal plaque that contain the name and death date of the deceased. And the coffin plate was often retrieved by the family and saved as a remembrance. It's certainly a unique resource for genealogists, and one, well, you may or may not find generally in Grandma's attic, but you may come across them in an archive. The 2 coffin plates you see here are part of 7 coffin plates of the Lewis family coffin plate collection that was donated to us through an estate of John Henry Edmonds in November of 1929. And we have a little bit of provenance here. The note that you see here on the top says, "Plates from the coffins of my family, collected when the bodies were placed in one grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge." So we do know that when bodies were moved from one place to another, the family took the coffin plates as keepsakes. The coffin plates represent the family of Dr. Winslow Lewis, who was born in 1799 and died in 1875. Dr. Lewis was a practicing physician, but he had a connection to NAHGS. He was elected a member here in 1857, and he served as the Society's president from 1861 to 1866. And these two plates are two of Dr. Winslow's sons. Frederick is represented on the left, who died at the age of 3 in 1830, and Winslow, who died 10 years later in 1840 at the age of 10. And both boys died of scarlet fever. Lewis's oldest son predeceased his brothers at the age of 2 in 1831, also of scarlet fever, but his plate is not among this collection. Sometimes the story behind an object, particularly the story of perhaps the acquisition, is more interesting than the object itself. And this is the case with the coffin plate for Rosella Perkins. My colleague David Allen Lambert, who's the chief genealogist here, donated this plate to us in 2017. Since childhood, David has loved two things: flea markets and genealogy. And as a genealogist, he often discovered lost treasures of other families, and he purchased them. When he was about 12 years old, he attended a barn sale near Campton, New Hampshire. And as the adult collectors were poring over antique farm equipment, David was going through the old trunks looking for old photographs and papers. And sitting out on a table was a small metal plaque. And at first he thought it was a silver serving dish. But when he picked it up and saw a name and a death date, he got curious. So being the budding genealogist he was at the time, he purchased the item for $3 and took it home. And he would later learn that it was a coffin plate. Now, it sat on a bookshelf at his home for many years, and then over time, he lost it. He couldn't find it until one day, about 10, 15 years ago, he discovered it in his family's attic. He eventually rediscovered the piece, and he was curious about Rosella. Since Rosella wasn't his ancestor, what should he do with this? Should he trace down her descendants and see who would want the plate? Who would he choose if he did so? What would happen to this plate? Could it get lost again? So he made another decision. As many NEHGS members do, he donated it to the society. And what about Rosella? Well, David did a little bit of research and found that Rosella's maiden name was Wickham. She was born in either Eden or Hyde Park in Lamoille County, Vermont in 1820. She later married in 1842 to John Burnham Perkins, and they lived in Elmore, Vermont. And Rosella's story ends in Elmore, where she died of cancer of the stomach on March 24, 1878, at the age of 58 years and 4 days. Frank Bigelow was a Civil War veteran and an attorney, and his book of pen and ink illustrations of Waltham, Massachusetts epitaphs were compiled sometime after the war, we think about 1867, and were donated to us by his daughter Blanche in July of 1905, a year after her father's death. And we believe that this was one of Frank's interests or pastimes, was the drawing of these graveyard epitaphs. And on the next slide, you'll see an example of some of his work. One of the oldest headstones in the book is the one on the right. That's Grace Harrington, who died at the age of 33 in 1703. And the one on the left is of Elijah Mixer at the age of 20 in 1792 of smallpox. But what's the historical value of Bigelow's work? Well, it preserves the information on the headstones, and for genealogical purposes, it captures this information for us that were today, 150 plus years later, could be illegible or have been broken. And I did take the time to trace down Grace Harrington's headstone, and it has begun to sink into the ground. So 100 years from now, when we may no longer be able to see Grace's headstone, we'll at least have the epitaph memorialized for people to see here. Among the many collections we have of graveyards and headstones and cemetery inscriptions, we have a handful of photographs collections of cemetery headstones. And one of the oldest and more interesting was donated to us in 1931 by Harriet Merrifield Forbes. There are over 1,000 black and white photos that are mounted on paper, and they document the sculpture on 17th and 18th century gravestones throughout New England. Now, Harriet had an interest in stone cutters, and these photographs were part of the work that she published in her book in 1927 on gravestones of early New England and the men who made them. So some of the pages contain handwritten annotations identifying the stone cutter, dates concerning the purchase of the stone, or the stone's composition. Harriet used a glass plate negative camera mounted on a tripod, and she traveled all across New England, dragging along her relatives with her. The value of her preserving these photos and donating them to us cannot be underestimated. Not only do these gravestones tell the stone cutter's story or show the individual style, but the images carved on the stones reflect the culture of the day and the attitudes towards death. One of the more interesting headstones photos in the collection is that of Florio, or sometimes referred to as Flora Hercules, the wife of Hercules, governor of the Negroes, as it says here. She died in April 1741, and the headstone is located in the ancient burial ground in New London, Connecticut. Now, I was intrigued by this photo because I had never heard of the title Governor of the Negroes, and I discovered that this was a practice that dated back to the 1750s in Connecticut. And what it would be is that the Black community would elect their own governors or kings, and they would settle disputes among the Black community and met out punishments if need be. And they also served as intermediaries with the white community. And this practice continued until the mid-19th century. From our Jewish Heritage Center, we have another example. This is from the collection of records of the Jewish community in Peabody, Massachusetts. This is an example of Chevrah Kadisha, which is a Jewish burial society group, and the group was usually tasked with preparing the bodies for burial. This purification process is known as tahara, and it involves the cleansing of the body by a group of male or female volunteers. The Chevrah Kadisha is responsible for sitting with the body from the moment of death until burial. It's responsible for the ritual cleansing, and in many cases helps the family of the deceased arrange for meals and prayer services during the period of mourning known as Shiva. And to be a member of the Chevrah Kadisha is considered to be an honor. These particular items are list the dead for the Maple Hill Cemetery in Peabody, Massachusetts. On the right is the original document, the book that it was recorded in, and on the left you have the translated, transcribed entries. The Maple Hill Cemetery includes a section for the burial of interfaith families, as Jewish custom dictates that Jews should not be buried in mixed faith cemeteries. Funeral records are an important resource in genealogical research because they often can contain information not found on a death certificate. Now, we have many published books of funeral home records, mostly of New England, but some of funeral homes outside of the New England area. And we have 4 manuscript collections of original funeral home records, including the Gaines Funeral Home of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which you see an image here. It is known as the longest operating African-American owned business in Western Pennsylvania. And it includes a ton of information: the names of the deceased, the date of birth, the death, the funeral service, and often the names and birthplaces of the parents. From a historical perspective, it shows that migration of Black families leaving the rural South and moving to the Northeast and the Midwest in the early part of the 20th century. Although none of these collections are online, we are hoping to create an online database in 2021 for the Gaines Funeral Home records. Now, over the years, we've acquired many unusual items. We've had a skeleton in our collection, a thigh bone of an unidentified Revolutionary War soldier, to the last corncob pipe smoked by Andrew Jackson in the White House, to a piece of marble from Caesar's Palace, and I'm not talking about the one in Las Vegas. So while we no longer have many of these items, we still continue to have unusual and odd items come to us through collections. And I'd like to highlight two recent ones that have a connection to mourning and grief. So here you have the Royall Family hair book, and hair wasn't used just for jewelry, but it was used in other means in the decorative arts and as a form of friendship as well as mourning. This item was donated to us in 2014 by a member who lives out in California. The Royall Family hair book was passed down in the Royall family to the donor's mother, and we believe the hair book represents the work of Anne Eliza Royall, who was born in 1834 and died in 1888 of Crawford County, Pennsylvania. The families represented in the book include the Royalls, Curtis, the Hall, and Mygate families, who all came out of Connecticut to New York and eventually settled in Crawford County. The original entries under each piece of hair you'll find the name of the person, and you'll also see on the right that family members, and because you can see it through the different handwriting, would go back and record different family information. The piece on the right is mourning, and we know that through the black hair ribbon and the dates of death recorded. Pasted on the inside cover were family obituaries, but they are of special note because they're all of young people who died suddenly or of disease at a young age. The obituary on the left-hand side from 1903 is particularly sad as it recounts the death of Fred Royall, who at the age of 28 died of appendicitis. And next to it is pasted his marriage announcement, which had occurred, his marriage had occurred just a few months before in May of 1903. When the Nielsen McVickers Sutton papers were dropped off to us here at NEHGS a few years ago, I assumed it would be a typical collection of a mix of original family papers and some genealogical research. And as I was going through the boxes, I found an envelope that you see here on the right of the Spiritual Communications to John Campbell, 1860. Now, in it, I found questions and responses supposedly that were used in a seance. So I did a little digging, and I discovered that John Campbell was born in the townland of Ballyrobin in County Antrim, Ireland in 1804, and we know that he came to New York City sometime before his 1828 marriage to Louise Ann Lawrence of Orange, New Jersey, and they settled in New York City, where he became a successful hardware merchant. And he died suddenly at the age of 56 on the 28th of May, 1861, and his bereaved widow Louisa sought consolation for her grief by attending seances, hoping to communicate with her late husband. And I think these sessions proved so comforting to Louisa that she soon wanted to hear from other deceased members of the family. So the blue pieces of paper that you see here contain deceased person's name with the questions asked. And then there are the responses, most likely written by the medium in the room, that also accompany these papers. As we come to a close, I just want to share some general tips for caring and donating your family treasures. And the general guidelines or rules that we often encourage people in terms of caring for your treasures is always, always avoid exposure to direct light of your original photographs, paper, and artwork. And try to keep and find a stable room, let me back that up, a room in your home with stable temperature where it may not be located to pipes or bathrooms, etc. So maybe a closet, but that doesn't have a bathroom or water pipes above or next to it. You want to keep your objects clean, and you want to clean with care. You also want to watch out for bugs and other pests. More importantly, you want to consult an expert. And speaking of that, experts, here's the person I always turn to for advice for caring for our items is our conservator, Todd Pattison. And you can get preservation tips from his guide on preserving your family treasures on our website. And the URL you'll see right here. So what's in your closet? Do you think you have items of historical value in your possession? And also, what will become of them? I get these questions all the time of potential donors. So maybe you might want to consider donating them to a local archive or other repository. Why would you want to donate items? Well, it can provide long-term preservation for your family treasures, but it also allows researchers such as genealogists and others to access and use the information and to use the items. I always encourage people to start locally, start where you live to look for repositories. Try to determine based on the information that you have, the subject or the format, the most likely place to donate your materials to. Always, always reach out to the repository before you choose to donate. What will they take? And also ask, how will it be cared for? Will it be accessible? What about restrictions, copyright, etc.? But remember, measure your expectations when you donate. Not everything is of historical or research value, so you may sometimes be turned down for some of the items that you have in your collection. But always consider donating your items. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of the stories from our archives and learning learning more about some of the objects of mourning that we have from the NAHGS Special Collections and the Weiner Jewish Heritage Center, and I will be happy to take questions.
All right, well, thank you, Judy. So yes, let's get to some questions. Go ahead and type them into the questions panel. We're almost just about at 4 o'clock Eastern time, but we'll stick around and answer a few questions. So Karen asks, what is the best way to preserve jewelry that's made, or a hair book, for example, something that's made with hair? How do we preserve it in our archives?
Well, we preserve hair books in acid-free, lignin-free materials. So for example, we have 2 hair books in our collection. The Rundle hair book that you see right now is in conservation, so it will be conserved by Todd. But we usually have a special enclosure. Sometimes we will just have a folder and within an archival box. But depending upon if the material is very fragile, we'll have special enclosures made by Todd. So sometimes you can have those done. We frequently just purchase regular archival quality material from an archival vendor. Jewelry, on the other hand, the Atkinson Lancaster jewelry, for example, was in a box and it was all thrown together. And with that, stuff can get scratched. So what we've done temporarily, and in working with Todd, is right now we have it in archival acid-free, lignin-free envelopes, special envelopes. But I would look at a place like Gaylord.com. They offer free tips and advice for all kinds of material, from wedding dresses to jewelry, and it's available on their website for free. So I would always look to seek out information on how to carefully preserve your items.
And the subject guide that Judy mentioned that was done and authored by Todd Pattison on preserving your family treasures, I will include that link to everyone in a follow-up email as well. And that has some great advice, and I believe it does offer some links or suggestions for these archival vendors that you just mentioned. Rachel is asking about the Waltham gravestones that we showed. Is that digitized? Is it available on our website? If someone does want to look at some of these resources, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, the Bigelow material, the Waltham, Massachusetts epitaphs, are not digitized, but it is on our list to be digitized. When that will occur, I do not know, but we hope to do that in the near future. Most of the items that you saw here today are not online, particularly from our special collections. How you can access those? Well, if you are a member, you can look for these items in our library catalog. You can contact me directly and use them. Unfortunately, you do have to be a member to access our manuscript materials. You can also take advantage, if you live at a distance, you can take advantage of our photocopy service.
And Deborah says, I have some black cards with gold lettering detailing ancestors' name, birth, and death, and in the gold letters. Could those be funeral cards? And that's something that we didn't necessarily touch upon. Funeral cards, but do those sound like funeral cards? Do you want to say anything about preserving those, or how those might fit into someone's collection?
They sound like they could be memorial cards or funeral cards. We do have some in our collections that have come with family papers, and sometimes we have found them in family Bibles that are donated to us. Given that they're small items and you don't want to lose them, I would say just storing them loosely in a folder within a box is probably not a good idea. So you want to get perhaps an archival type envelope and a little bit bigger than the size of the cards, and store them that way. And then, either store the envelopes in a flat archival box or in folders within an archival box. But that's what I would recommend. You don't want to keep them loose in something where they're going to fall out of.
All right, and Paula asks or says, I have old letters from a great uncle who wrote home during World War I, as well as a Wounded in Action poster. Where would be a good place to donate something like that? And we had a few tips on kind of how to research places that might be repositories that might take your collections. What might be your first step or advice for Paula?
Well, Paula, it depends on where you live. You may want to reach out to where your ancestor lived from the local historical society. See if there is an active local historical society that takes manuscript materials. There is the World War I Museum, and we also actively collect World War I materials. It is a time period which we don't have a lot of materials from. Our strength is up to the mid-19th century. So I'm always looking for materials from late 19th into 20th century because we do use those materials in exhibits and in lectures, etc.
All right, thank you. Just a few more questions before wrapping up for today. So Cindy asks, where might I find more information on porcelain photographs on gravestones? We had a few examples from the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center. If there is an item like porcelain photographs or other items, how do you suggest people starting to research or learn more about the items that they have in their collection?
That's a really interesting question and a very good one. We don't personally have it in any HGS collections, but as you saw, the Jewish Heritage Center does. I mean, I would start with online, just searching in a search engine like Google. You would be surprised at the number of resources that are available now online that talk about a lot of objects of mourning. It is where I have learned a lot about mourning jewelry. So I would start there. There may be published resources as well that you could probably consult, but I would start online and see if you can find anything that provides a historical background on them, their use, etc.
All right. Well, thank you again, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I know that we weren't able to get to everything today, but if you would like more hands-on help with your genealogical research, the specifics of your family history, you may consider scheduling a consultation, a one-on-one consultation with a genealogical expert, or hiring our research services team. You can learn more about those services by contacting the email addresses that you see on your screen. And I also want to let you know about a recent expansion of our free online chat service. So you can live chat online with our genealogists Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And the service is open to everyone, and it can be accessed at americanancestors.org/chat. So you do not need to be a member to take advantage of this service. Like I said, it's free, open to the public, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'll be including all of that information as well as a link to the recording and to that subject guide on preserving your family treasures in my follow-up email later today. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback as we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And I just want to note as well that this free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for others around the world. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.